Over the course of 3 bloody wars, Carthage had tightened its grip on the island of Sicily, and yet on the precipice of its success, Dionysius of Syracuse had rallied his city to not only hold them at bay, but to throw them back. While the Punic power was rocked by plague and civil unrest, the tyrant would now take his chance to fulfill his life's work. All of Sicily and beyond would be his, even if he had to do it himself. To the victors, wars like these earned you trading posts, prized territory, and assortments of riches, including valuables that are displayed in museums across the world today. Now, this art is preserved for historical purposes. But to society's elite, art can also be a powerful financial asset. With its limited supply and high demand, fine art tends to retain value during periods of economic crisis. And since the art market has a near zero correlation with stocks and real estate, the volatility of those assets typically has little effect on art's value, making it a popular tool to protect wealth. Just last month, Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen sold his Van Gogh painting for $117 million, an 8,000% increase since its first purchase in 1935. And even though we can't go back in time and get our hands on masterpieces, we can still potentially harness the value of art as an investment. Today's sponsor, Masterworks, allows you to invest in museum-grade art for a fraction of the cost. They buy artwork by legendary artists like Picasso, Monet, and Banksy and qualify it with the SEC, allowing almost anyone to diversify their investments with blue-chip art. Most investors have already seen a sea of red this year, and according to Bloomberg, the average portfolio is down over 30%. But not everyone's portfolio is totally dying. Recently, a Masterworks member earned over $65,000 from his investment in art, and I'll let you in on a secret. The guy had never invested in art before finding Masterworks. If he can invest in art, why can't you? 600,000 people have joined so far, and demand is growing. But my subscribers can get priority access, so click the link in the description below to get started. Thank you to Masterworks for sponsoring this video. With Carthage out of the picture, Dionysius' first move was to resecure local control. This was done by rebuilding his forces and bullying the communities of Sicily back onto his side. In these matters, his greatest opposition came from the Sicily tribes and Ionian Greeks of the northeast, which had recently suffered at the tyrant's hands. The city of Rhegium in particular posed a threat, in that it had arisen in might with the destruction of Messana, which gave it control of the important straits between Sicily and Italy. To make matters worse, when Dionysius had attempted to arrange an alliance by seeking one of their noble daughters in marriage, the people of Rhegium merely offered him the executioner's daughter. The following years thus became a great game of political and military maneuvers over control of eastern Sicily. Part of this involved the founding of various colonies and the relocation of wartime refugees to secure strategic control of key regions. This was done by both sides, with the peoples of the land serving as pawns in their schemes. Dionysius knew that winning this contest would take time, and that while engaged, it would leave him susceptible to a two-front war should Carthage attack from the west. He therefore seems to have secured support from the central Sicani and Sicily tribes, who might act as a buffer. As a part of this political realignment, the cities of Agrarium, Hermitage, and Asorus pledged their loyalty, while the cities of Solus, Enna, and Keflarium were supposedly betrayed to the tyrant and sacked. Now Dionysius could focus his efforts on the east. Thus in 394 BC, he raised a large army which likely boasted around 20,000 infantry and several thousand cavalry. His main target was the city of Tauromenium. It was actually a hilltop stronghold which had been built up by the Carthaginians and filled with sickles just 3 years prior with the express purpose of serving as a bulwark against Syracusan expansion. This fortress could not be allowed to stand. The Greek army approached from the south, camping in the ruins of Naxos before continuing their advance against Tauromenium. Such a move would not have gone unnoticed. After all, the city lay perched atop the 200-meter tall Mount Taurus and held a commanding view of the region. In addition, it was surrounded by cliffs, ravines, and high walls which made a direct assault impossible without significant investment. Nonetheless, Dionysius was determined to take it. Operations apparently began quite late in the year, as the Greeks established their encircling positions before settling down in the lowland region of Naxos to wait out the defenders. But the Sicels were well prepared and managed to hold on until the winter months approached. Normally, this was a time when armies powered down. And yet for Dionysius, this idle time was an opportunity to scheme. Whilst the snow fell heavily upon Mount Taurus, it was reported that the guards of Tauromenium had grown lax in their watch. This was the precise moment Dionysius had been waiting for. Upon a moonless, stormy night, he summoned a picked force of 600 mercenaries. Together, they navigated the ravines of the mountains before coming to the base of the enemy's Acropolis. Here, they made sure to secure any loose belongings and cover any flashing metal before beginning the ascent. In the cold, wet darkness they climbed. The jagged cliffs and howling winds likely took their toll on the men, but Dionysius pressed on. Eventually, the infiltrators had reached the top. Now, 600 men swarmed over the battlements, silencing the sentries and slaying any garrisons they came upon. By the light of dawn, it appeared that Dionysius' bold gamble had paid off. However, alarms were soon raised across the city as the defenders were roused from their beds. Soon, these had gathered enough of their wits and their numbers to launch a counterattack. Dionysius and his commandos may have been able to hold their advance in check initially, but with exhaustion setting in and no source of reinforcements, it was only a matter of time before a breach was formed by a persistent assault. Eventually this came, and it washed over the Syracusans like a great tide, wiping out vast swaths of the 600 mercenaries in the blink of an eye. These quickly sought the only escape available to them, the very cliffs that they had scaled that night. We are told that as men tumbled off the ravines, many lost their armor and their lives. Dionysius was one of the few to make it out alive. Rather than face further humiliation, the tyrant now lifted the siege and withdrew his army to lick his wounds back home. While Dionysius may have averted any immediate disaster with his withdrawal, the event did have wider strategic consequences. For instance, the Greek cities of Acragas and Messana deposed their Syracusan supporting leaders and garrisons, while others began to reassess their allegiances. This wavering posed an opportunity for Carthage to exploit. After several years of crippling distractions, the African power had finally emerged from the chaos thanks to the generalship of Mago, the victor of the Battle of Catana. He had helped defeat the Libyan uprising and next led forces to Sicily. At first, Carthage had been wary of directly engaging with Dionysius and instead spent its time shoring up support on the western side of the island and playing the part of the benevolent overlord which stood in contrast to the tyrant of Syracuse. Yet following Dionysius' stumble at Tauromenium, Mago now pounced at the opportunity for direct confrontation. In 393 BC, the Punic general launched an expedition across the northern side of the island. The size of the force goes unreported, but it was apparently large enough to raid Messana. Upon turning back, they would be intercepted by a pursuing Dionysius. The two clash at the Battle of Abacanum, with Mago being defeated and forced to seek shelter in the nearby city. Yet both sides would soon part ways in what appears to have been more of a strategic joust than an all-out war. The next year, Mago would receive reinforcements from Carthage and mustered a large force that may have boasted as many as 40,000 to 50,000 men. The actions of the fleet are not mentioned, and so it is assumed that this year's campaign saw Mago lead his forces across the interior of Sicily. His objective appears to have been to chip away at the Sicyl communities which were siding with Syracuse. Such a challenge could not go unanswered. Dionysius mustered his own army and advanced to meet them. However, we are told that his army was far smaller. As a result, he relied on asymmetrical tactics to stall Mago's advance. Mountain passes and high ground positions were held stubbornly by the Greeks, while raiders were sent incessantly to harass the Punic supply lines. And yet, Carthage remained undeterred and continued its slow advance. It was only through a great deal of negotiating and favorable concessions that Dionysius managed to secure the military support of the powerful city of Agrium. Together, the Greeks were able to prevent Carthage from steamrolling through the territory. And yet, they were still outnumbered. Dionysius chose to continue his delay tactics in the hopes that Carthage might be too worn down to fight, or that plague might once again prove his savior. However, as the weeks rolled by, neither materialized. Instead, it was the Syracusan forces which began to lose morale and desert. The situation got so bad that Dionysius reportedly freed and armed slaves to refill his ranks. Thankfully, this was not something that was noticed by Carthage. The invaders had their hands full with other problems. Thus, as the stalemate dragged on, it seems that both Mago and Dionysius found a de-escalation to their mutual advantage. Therefore, the two leaders came to the peace table willingly. The treaty, which was hammered out, essentially formalized either side's control of East and West Sicily. For Dionysius, this meant finally formalizing a decade's worth of territorial expansion, whilst giving him free reign to play kingmaker among the Sicilian communities of the east. Carthage, meanwhile, gained clear dominion over the Phoenician and Elmian communities of the west, which would allow them to focus on their lucrative mercantile endeavors. The deal would stand for nearly a decade. Yet this did not bring peace to Sicily. Dionysius was merely freed to continue his wars with his other rivals. This meant first securing control over eastern Sicily by rooting out the last vestiges of Punic influence. Many cities were brought to heel, and even Tauromenium was taken in a bloodless feat of diplomacy. Next, he set about reviving his feud with Rhegium. This would finally secure his control of the straits between Sicily and Italy and open the door to wider opportunities for expansion across Magna Graecia. In these campaigns, the city of Rhegium was put to siege on 3 separate occasions. This would climax in the year 387 BC. It was a brutal affair. Here is how Diodorus Siculus describes Dionysius' callous approach to warfare. Quote, "It was about the 11th month of Dionysius' siege of Rhegium, and since he had cut off relief from every direction, the inhabitants of the city were faced by a terrible dearth of the necessities of life. So reduced were they, by lack of food, that at first they ate their horses and other beasts of burden, then fed upon boiled skins and leather, and finally they would come out from the city and eat the grass near the walls like so many cattle. When Dionysius learned what was taking place, far from showing mercy to those who were suffering beyond man's endurance, on the contrary, he brought in cattle to clear the place of the green stuff, with the result that it was completely stripped. Consequently, the Rhegians, overcome by their excessive hardships, surrender their city to the tyrant, giving him complete power over their lives. Within the city, Dionysius found heaps of dead who had perished from lack of food, and the living too, whom he captured, were like dead men and weakened in body. He got together more than 6,000 captives, and the multitudes he sent off to Syracuse, with orders that those who could pay as ransom a mina of silver should be freed, but to sell as slaves those who were unable to raise that sum. In the ensuing campaigns, Dionysius would make war against other cities of Magna Graecia. Along with the Lucranians, he devastated the territories of Thurii and Croton. His fleet even raided as far as the Etruscan coast, pillaging a town just 50 kilometers from Rome. On the heels of these advances, Dionysius planted additional colonies along the Adriatic coast as far away as Illyria in a bid to control trade and power in the region. But his ambitions did not stop there. During the Corinthian War, Dionysius backed Sparta with mercenaries and ships, and similarly sent troops to fight in Epirus to return King Alcetas to the throne. All of these moves were clear signs of Syracuse's growing power in the geopolitics of the era. Perhaps because of these successes, Dionysius finally felt prepared to once again challenge Carthage. Thus, in 383 BC, at the age of 49, he mobilized for war and renewed open hostilities by allying with cities which had risen in revolt against Carthage. Technically, this chapter of history would be known as the Fourth Punic Sicilian War. However, its scope extended beyond the confines of prior conflicts. Details are lacking, but it seems that Carthage had allied itself with a league of Italian cities and even landed troops to assist them with the campaign along the eastern theater of Magna Graecia. Meanwhile, the western theater of Sicily proper saw large Carthaginian and Syracusan forces jockey with one another. As had happened before, affairs on the island quickly stagnated into a campaign of skirmishing and maneuvering around the various communities. In this two-front war, neither side was prepared to risk it all in a pitched battle until they felt they had the upper hand. These conditions would not materialize until several years later, when the two sides clashed at the Battle of Cabala. Here, the forces of Syracuse managed to drive the Carthaginians from the field. The Punic army rallied upon a hill, but suffered heavy losses in the days which followed, when they were unable to find a sufficient source of water. Diodorus Siculus claims that 10,000 of their soldiers would perish, including the commanding general, while 5,000 men were taken captive. From this dominant position, Dionysius now laid down his terms for a ceasefire. Carthage must not only pay for the war damages, but must also withdraw entirely from the island of Sicily. Such terms were outrageously humiliating. Carthage was furious, but facing other troubles abroad, asked for a temporary ceasefire to consider the conditions. Yet this was merely a play for time. In the brief interlude which followed, Punic forces would be heavily drilled and disciplined. When they marched out again in 376 BC, under the command of Himilco Mago, they were a significantly more professional force. Dionysius and his overly confident force rose to meet them at the Battle of Cronium. Here, tens of thousands of men faced off across a wide plain. As the two armies clashed, it proved to be an incredibly tough fight. Dionysius and his elite forces on the wing were slowly gaining ground against their foes. However, on the opposite side, Himilco managed to more rapidly defeat the forces of Leptines and began to turn the flank. Soon, panic spread across the Syracusan army. This now devolved into a complete rout, with the Carthaginians surging forward, shouting to one another to give no quarter. We are told that 14,000 Syracusans were slaughtered in this butcher's work. Now, it was Dionysius who was at the mercy of his foe. Thankfully, Carthage had other fires to put out and settled on relatively reasonable terms. These re-established the borders which had existed prior to the war, with the added terms that Carthage would now receive the cities of Selinus and Acragas, in addition to 1,000 talents. Sucking in his pride, Dionysius agreed to the deal. After all, he was always one to think 10 steps ahead. The peace would merely be another opportunity for him to plan yet further campaigns. For 8 years, the tyrant of Syracuse bid his time. In this period, some of his attentions were turned towards the arts, as he brought poets, playwrights, and philosophers to court. Yet there would be no replacement for his hunger for war. Thus, in 368 BC, Dionysius once again sallied out from his fortress of Syracuse to make war upon Carthage with a mighty army of around 40,000 men and 120 warships. These rapidly advanced upon the city of Eryx. It was taken by surprise, securing a prominent base for the Greek operations deep within Punic territory. Dionysius' next move was to besiege the city of Lilybaeum. It had been founded 30 years ago, following the Greek destruction of Mattia, and now stood as the greatest center of Carthaginian power on the island. This bastion would not be allowed to fall. The Punic garrison held firm for the remainder of the year, forcing Dionysius to return to nearby Eryx for his winter quarters. However, a fleet of 200 Carthaginian ships was already on the move. Avoiding detection, it now launched its own surprise attack upon Eryx. Here, they fell upon the massed Greek fleet at anchor, sinking or capturing vast numbers of ships. This would be a crippling blow. Without naval superiority, the Syracusan land army stood no chance of taking the offense and would now be pushed back to protect its rear from enemy raids and landings. The last grand campaign of Dionysius had collapsed in spectacular fashion. Ever the wily negotiator though, he nonetheless managed to sign an armistice which prevented any further erosion of his position. There would always be a next time. As a bit of consolation, Dionysius would return home to the news of one great victory. Apparently, his play The Ransom of Hector had won a prestigious competition at the Linnea Festival of Athens. To celebrate and forget the sorrows of the year, he would reportedly throw a massive party, drinking himself into oblivion. According to some sources, Dionysius would literally drown in alcohol. Others claim that it would be a conspiracy of his kin which finally brought low the tyrant of Syracuse that night. Whatever the case, Dionysius would be dead at the age of 65. He left behind a legacy that would be unmatched by any of his predecessors or forebears. For the 38 years of his reign, Dionysius had fought toe-to-toe with one of the mightiest powers of the Western Mediterranean whilst building up the position of Syracuse to become one of the greatest in the entire Greek world. The model of his rule, the methods of his war-making, and the innovations in siege and naval technology would pave the way for the greatest conquerors who came after him, including Alexander the Great. Such shoes would be difficult to fill, even for the most capable of heirs. Unfortunately for Syracuse, his son Dionysius II fell far below the mark. Forgoing the great affairs of state, he turned inward with no care for maintaining the hard-fought works of his father. Plutarch offers the following insight into his actions. Quote, "For it is said that the young king once kept up a drinking bout for 90 consecutive days from its beginning, and that during this time the court gave no access or admission to men of matters of consequence. But drunkenness and raillery, and music and dancing and buffoonery held full sway." And so it was, with great pleasure, that Carthage watched as the formidable house of Syracuse began to collapse. The final climax of the Punic Sicilian Wars loomed on the horizon, but these would be amongst its bloodiest. I hope you found this episode entertaining and enlightening. You can head on over to our Patreon to participate in polls, catch script previews, and get HD downloads of all of our art. We owe a huge debt to our current patrons for funding the channel, and to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. We certainly couldn't have done it without this team and this community. So be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.